directly and indirectly to bring some of the most effective organizational structures, including 350, the Sunrise Movement, and now his newest cohort of climate activists and advocates, 60 years of age and above, Third Act. He's helped focus us on addressing fossil fuel emissions and divesting from the funding of the fossil fuel industry. And he's responsible for getting me, and probably a number of us, entrenched in the climate movement. If you have questions for Bill regarding the building of a climate movement, please keep them very brief and on today's theme and put them in the Q&A, and Hoyen will help filter those to me.
Yes.
So thank you, Bill, for speaking with us today. We want to focus on movement building. To understand why Sierra Club members should care about this, can you give your perspective on why we need to grow a climate movement?
I sure can. First of all, what a pleasure to see both you and Hoyen, and what a pleasure to get to join you all. Greetings from Vermont. We're looking with extraordinary jealousy at the huge amounts of snow piling up in the High Sierra. It's been a warm, miserable winter back east, and we could not be more envious, and we could not be more grateful for the incredible work that the club has been doing. I'm especially happy because my old friend Ben Jealous, I think just there could not be a better choice to be leading the club. And I was very happy that just about the first public event he did in his new role was to come and talk to the whole Third Act national audience last month, to help get people hyped up and ready for this big day on March 21st, when we're all taking on the banks that fund the fossil fuel industry. So let me talk about movement building for a minute, because I'm in many ways the right person to ask, because it took me so long to figure it out. And it's something that I kick myself for all the time. I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect, back in 1989. So a long time ago, a book called The End of Nature. And I was in my 20s then, and a writer or a journalist. And I think my basic theory of change was people will read my book and then they'll change. And in fact, tons of people read the book. It came out in 24 languages or something like that, and was a bestseller all over the place. But turns out that's not really how change gets made, at least by itself. And for the next 10 years, I kept writing more books and organizing symposiums and articles and on and on and on. And I think what I was thinking, and what a lot of other people were thinking, was that our job was to win the argument around climate change, and that once we'd won that argument, then the powers that be would take the action that was necessary, because why wouldn't they? They'd been duly warned by the world's scientific authorities that the worst thing that has ever happened in our history of our civilization was underway, and so you would think that they would act. It took me way too long to figure out that we had won the argument. Within 5 years, there was a robust worldwide scientific consensus on what was happening, a consensus that hasn't shifted in 3 decades. We were winning the argument, but we were still losing the fight, because the fight, as I finally figured out, wasn't about data and evidence and reason. The fight was about what fights are usually about: money and power. And the other side in this fight, had the fossil fuel industry, had so much money and had so much political power that the fact that they'd lost the argument, and it was quite clear that they were wrecking the planet, hardly put a hitch in their step. And that was the point, again, much too late, when it became clear to me that we should be building some power of our own. I had no real idea how to do it. I'm just a writer. And I live off in the woods and whatever, but with 7 students here at Middlebury College, the nearby college, about 15 years ago, we formed 350.org, which became the kind of first global grassroots climate campaign. We think we've organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every country except North Korea. And we helped, lead the fight around the Keystone Pipeline, which was the first big loss for big oil. And then, as you said, we launched this fossil fuel divestment campaign, which has become the largest sort of anti-corporate campaign of its kind in history. We're at about $40 trillion now in endowments and portfolios. I will, in passing, note that I'm really glad that the club is working hard on SB 252, which is the bill to divest CalSTRS and CalPERS from fossil fuel. And then I think has a real chance of passing this year, since the guy who stopped it last year, Jim Cooper, has gone off to be the sheriff of Sacramento or something. So maybe it can work its way through the legislature unimpeded this time. At any rate, the thing that really strikes me after my experience with 350 and elsewhere, and so many, is that pretty often when we fight, we win. That if we do the work of organizing, doesn't come easily, never does, but man, I watched that amazing work that people did around California and helped out where I could to get setbacks for oil wells and so on and so forth. And people worked on it forever, and finally it happened. Now, of course, we're going to have to fight to defend it against the oil companies, putting it back on the ballot and things. But when we fight, we often win, so we should fight more often. And the only way to do that is build movements. Lobbyists are wonderful things, but politicians are like they're like meteorological instruments for reading the political temperature. They're very well aware that when a lobbyist walks into their office, whether or not they have juice behind them, whether or not they can summon people to either reward or punish that politician for what they're doing. That's what movements are. And that's why we have to, I think, just keep building them all the time. Now we're working to build them with old people like me. So there you go.
Okay, so speaking of that, can you tell us a little bit about Third Act and why you think this new organization can help do something a little different?
Yes, I can. So I've mostly organized with young people in my life. We started 350 with college students, and then a lot of this divestment campaign was on college campuses, and the kids who did that amazing work, including in the UC system, which was a huge, important win. When they got out of college and they wanted to keep going, they went on to found the Sunrise movement. I didn't have anything to do with it, but I know them all and love them all and got to work with them. And then, of course, I got to watch and in wonder as Greta Thunberg and 10,000 Greta Thunbergs around the planet mobilized junior high and high school students around this issue. Greta's one of my favorite people on earth, and I love working with her. But she'd be the first to say, there are many, many, many of me, and there are, including, as you know, lots in this country. They had 10 million kids out on climate strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. That's good organizing. So the kids are doing absolutely everything that one could ask of them. I confess, I heard one too many people say to me, well, it's up to the next generation to solve these problems. Which strikes me, A, as ignoble, and B, as highly impractical. For all their intelligence, energy, and idealism, young people lack the structural power to make change by themselves in the time that we have. And if you look around for who does have structural power, one of the groups that possesses it is what we've taken to calling experienced Americans, people over the age of 60. There are 70 million of us in this country. And, multiply that by some factor because they all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. So they have tremendous political clout, and fairly or not, ended up with most of the money. 70% of the country's financial assets belong to the boomers or the silent generation, compared with about 5% for millennials. So if you want to tackle Washington or Sacramento, or you want to tackle Wall Street, pays to have some people with hairlines like mine in this fight. Now, the reason that people haven't done more organizing with older people is not, I mean, obviously, as groups like the Sierra Club demonstrate, older Americans are, key part of every coalition and things. But the reason that people haven't tried, at least since the Gray Panthers in the 1970s, to kind of consciously organize older people is because there's a strong conventional wisdom that people become more conservative as they age. That may or may not have been true at some point, but I don't think it needs to be true for this generation of older people. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, your first act was during this period of epic social, cultural, political transformation. If you don't believe me, look at the things that the retrograde Supreme Court targeted last summer as they went on their rampage. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1970, and Roe v. Wade from 1973. These were things that people in this generation either fought for or were witness to the fight around. And it's painful to watch them be surrendered. And one of the things we keep saying is, we won these fights once, we can win them again. In their first year, Third Act has done remarkably well. We've got tens of thousands of volunteers around the country, many thousands in California already, and there are working groups spread out around the country, including 3 in California in different regions. And what we're trying to do is protect the climate, protect the political climate, because we think you need democracy working to have any hope of doing the other things we need to do. So we're working hard around racialized voter suppression and voter registration and on and on and on. But what we're really, in the end, trying to do is help older Americans reconfigure their idea of what you're supposed to do and what you're supposed to feel in the latter years of your life. I've seen sometimes that bumper sticker that people stick on the back of their Winnebagos sometimes, the one that says, "I'm spending my kid's inheritance." That's pretty gross, but it's also kind of true. It's been what we've been doing in the largest sense. And so we're trying very much to turn that around, and we're having lots of fun doing it.
Thank you. You mentioned SB 252. I just wanted to give kudos to Jim Stewart, who's on the call, who helped kind of inspire Senator Gonzalez to push that a number of years ago. And this is the next iteration of it. So question, I think that, that's an example of how our cross-campaign work amongst different organizations really helps inspire each other. Are we doing enough to ensure that the leaders in the climate movement are always aware of each other's next great idea? Do we need a regular standing meeting for those leaders outside of the COP?
Well, this is, part of my work for a long time is, I've for many years been trying to sort of take a seat in this work and let others, sort of shine the spotlight on others. And so much of my work for many years has been trying to get good ideas to the fore and good leaders to the fore. And it's been wonderful to get to do that. It's been such a pleasure over the last decade to watch huge leadership from frontline and vulnerable communities and from indigenous communities here and around the globe. People have grown used to understanding the importance, say, of indigenous leadership on this continent, having watched Dakota Access and so many other fights. But the same thing is true all over the planet, whether you're talking about the South Pacific or the Antipodes or wherever you are. And so that's been very exciting. I think that the work that we've always tried to do at 350 and now at Third Act is all about this building of coalitions. And this day of action on banks that we're coming up to in a few weeks is a good example. Um, we decided to just name the day, and we picked March 21st because it's 32123, too palindromic a name to date to pass up easily. But we instantly started reaching out to everybody else to get completely engaged here, and everybody has. The club was one of the very first, and a real shout out to a guy named Ben Cushing, who's been doing an awful lot of the work around climate finance at a national level for the club, and is a wonderful resource. Um, and and but yeah, some of it is just people who know each other telling each other things that are going on. I was so happy when Ben um, um, took over the club, because when we were starting the fight around Keystone XL, I wrote the letter that asked people to come to Washington in the summer of 2011 to do the actions that turned into the biggest civil disobedience action in the country about anything in a very long time. And Ben at that point was head of the NAACP. And I asked him to help. Now, like they had their board was not much keener than those days than the Sierra Club board was on having their leaders go be involved in actual civil disobedience. But Ben showed up the very first night to help train people who were going to get arrested the next morning, and that was really, really key. And then, not long afterwards, he dispatched one of his board members, the great, truly great civil rights leader Julian Bond, to come join the protests. So I had the honor of getting to be handcuffed to Julian Bond in the same paddy wagon. One of the great pleasures of great honor, privileges of my whole life. But that's how, sometimes that's how it works. We don't do always a great job of communicating because people get siloed in their own organizations, and there's all this internal communication, and everybody's got Slack channels going and on and on and on. So one of the things I do with my writer's hat on is try to keep those, I publish a free newsletter every week or so on Substack called The Crucial Years. It's all free. And one of the things I try to do there is just pass around all the best new good ideas I've heard from what's happening, because we do need a few of these spaces to kind of share information. Let me just add, the real pleasure always is working across organizations, across generations, and part of the great fun of doing this work at Third Act is that we've tried very intentionally to be working with young people, quite young people, the sort of Greta generation. And that's actually been very fruitful. It turns out that the relationship between people who are the age of grandparents and grandchildren is a lot easier than the relationship between people who are the age of parents and children. Everybody cuts each other a lot more slack, and it's really been fun. We were down at a big demonstration in New York against these banks a few weeks ago, and there were hundreds of high school kids there, because there always are. They completely get what's happening. And being somewhat sprier, they were at the front of the march. But at the back of the march, there was a big group of us from Third Act with a big banner that said "Fossils Against Fossil Fuels." So, trying to figure out how to do this in the right spirit seems important to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. You answered one of my questions I was going to ask you, which was about, cross-pollination of those intergenerational groups. And I just wanted to relate to you that I spent about a year organizing with Sunrise Movement. Despite my age, I was 49 years old, and they let me know a few months in that I was going to be too old to continue to help work with them. But it was fantastic to work with a younger generation, and it really broadens your perspective. And I do encourage everybody on the call to do as much of that as they can to really get their minds expanded a little bit. I wanted to ask if there's anything that has worked brilliantly for you in the past that you'd like to make sure that Sierra Club's not missing out on in terms of movement building.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, one of the things that I think is important building movements is that you know, historically environmentalists have done a pretty good job of appealing to whichever half of the human brain it is that likes, pie charts and bar graphs and all of that. And not such a good job appealing to the more visceral part of the of ourselves. Um, it's very important, as I said earlier, to win the argument, and you need all the data and all the reports and all the white papers and on and on and on. But by itself, it's not enough. You also need the other things that matter for humans. So we've always worked hard to make art and music important parts of the organizing that we do everywhere. Images and um, right now, as I'm thinking about this a lot, as we're heading into this banks big day of action on the banks, you can see some of the banners behind me there. Those are come from the Bay Area. A couple of weeks ago, our wonderful uh, arts coordinator for this project, David Solnit, the brother of Rebecca Solnit, the greatest essayist at work in the English language, and one of my movement colleagues from the beginning, someone I always love working with. Anyway, David is the greatest uh, sort of arts activist that I've ever come across, incredibly adept at organizing hundreds of other people to become sort of artists themselves and to silk screen things and learn how to make amazing images in the center of sidewalks and intersections and do all the things that can make movements pop. The same with music. When when my young colleagues tease me, go on and on about okay boomer and all this stuff, I always nod politely because I know what they're talking about, and then I say, but you do have to grant that our generation did produce the greatest music that there ever was. And so it's been really fun to get Carole King and Neil Young and Patti Smith and on and on and on involved in this kind of work, get them pushing. And now we have a sort of musician in residence, Lou Aya, who's wonderful hip hop inflected um, um, musician activist who's been organizing all the music as we get ready for 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, and we've got lots of music we can sing and stuff we can do. That stuff really counts. It's as important as the white paper is in because because you win these fights when you bring enough people into the field. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, the good news is it doesn't have to be a majority of people. One of the lessons that movement builders need to console themselves with is the reminder that apathy cuts both ways. I helped organize 350, helped sort of lead the organizing for what became the first really big climate march in the world in 2014, when we brought, as it turns out, about 400,000 people to the streets of New York for a big, big march. And that took, as you can imagine, a lot of planning. And, most of it was the very mundane kind, like how many toilets do you need and on and on and on. The one thing we didn't worry about was that the next day, 400,000 people would show up to demand more fossil fuels. We counted on the fact that apathy would do its job in that direction. So if you can rouse your people, it doesn't have to be everybody, but if you're using art and music, in my experience, you'll get more of them.
Okay, is there anything that you've tried that you would say, or maybe you witnessed other organizations trying, that you would say, please don't try that? It was either ineffective or just a train wreck.
um, no, not so much. I mean, I think one should try everything. I think the things that get us into trouble sometimes are when we just pick one thing that we're after and then don't deviate, even that we're not nimble or enough. So, for instance, I have the absolute highest regard, incredible regard for all the people who built the Citizens Climate Lobby work over the last decade. They're some of the best organizers I've ever met, and they've built this huge coalition of people who worked incredibly hard around this single idea of a carbon fee and dividend thing, which is a very good idea. But when it became clear at some point that it was not going to work for the moment in our political structure, that the idea of a tax of any kind had become so verboten in American politics that it was a non-starter. Perhaps they might, a year or two quicker than they did, kind of pivot off that. Now they have and are doing lots of other interesting things. And I think that probably most of their leadership too would say, yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, but I'm glad they did what they did. And I think it's a reminder for all of us of that you do need that ability to be a little nimble and flexible in the face of changing political realities.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're witnessing that too. The CCL folks kind of reaching out to start working in coalition where they might not have before. Otherwise, they just wore two hats and they were part of two organizations. But
Right.
but it's great to see them participating in coalition the way we haven't seen them in the past. All right. Along the same lines, anything that you've considered trying but you never got enough momentum behind you, or you didn't have the resources? And I know these are kind of oddball questions, but I'm hoping that with the long time that you've been doing this, maybe something sticks out at you that you'd want to.
Well, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think if there's, I mean, we've tried an awful lot of things over the years, and some of them work better than others, and some of them I'd like the chance to redo again in certain ways. I'll tell you one idea that I've always had and we've always wanted to do and never quite gotten around to it. Um, I think that there's, we talk a lot about public transit and its importance, and it really is a key part of things, but we never really do a very good job of kind of celebrating what we have now and mobilizing those people as the environmental sort of heroes that there are. I've always wanted to do a global day where you just all around the world festooned buses and subways with balloons and streamers and banners, and gave free ice cream cone to everybody who got on, and reminded every bus driver that they were a environmental hero, and on and on and on. Taking just the idea is sort of take something, the sort of mundane part of our everyday life, and really understand it for what it is, and a really important part of this fight. And I think it's a place, among other things, where there's good work to be done bridging labor and environmentalism. The transit workers unions in this country are terrific, and I think would be responsive to this kind of work and things. So there's one thing I've always wished someone would grab hold of and do.
All right, Bill, let's make that happen. So Transit Equity Day is February 4th every year. And we're always looking for creative ways to make that happen. And I do know that some folks at Sierra Club have done events where they do a bus ride. And imagine a city or a town of any size that people showed up and used public transit in a way that they never had before. It's going to help us learn the system, because those of us with cars that don't need to use public transportation need to learn to use public transportation. So I really like that idea. We're going to follow up on that one, because I think that would be a great coalition effort that we could get everybody involved in. Bringing people together with different perspectives on how deep this crisis is can be challenging. Sometimes we're fighting for change and we realize the person next to us expects even more change or far less change than we do. Have you seen that? And how do you manage that disparity?
Well, I think that is that is very true. Um, and I think it's why it's good to have campaigns that are often focused on particular and fairly clear goals. So, sometimes that's really obvious. Stop the Keystone Pipeline, or in the case of this bank stuff, we've worked hard to try and come up with a demand that's both radical enough to make a big difference and practical enough to have some hope of achieving it. And the one that the movement's kind of hit on is stop funding anything that can be described as expansion of the fossil fuel industry. We're aware, sadly, given the hard work of Exxon and Chevron and their ilk, that we're going to still be using fossil fuel for some years to come. But we have to wean ourselves off it very fast. And that means that funding anything that grows the size of this is crazy. The world scientists have said this very clearly. The IPCC, the IEA, which is the least radical of groups, it's the International Energy Agency, set up by Henry Kissinger in the 1970s in the wake of the oil shocks. They said in 2021 there can be no more investment in new oil fields and things. That's what we're pressing the banks on. And in fact, in December, people scored a big victory when HSBC, the biggest bank by assets in Europe, agreed to essentially this demand. It's still a little unclear exactly how much of it they agreed to and things, but they took a big step, and that's what we're demanding from Citi and Chase and Wells Fargo and B of A. So that's an example of, and sometimes, sometimes it's hard to bridge. Sometimes, people will, I'll see on Twitter that people will say something about something good that they've managed to get done, some law they've passed or and someone else will immediately say, yes, but until we get rid of capitalism, it doesn't do any good. A point I kind of understand, I gotta say, but I also I don't have any plan for how you get rid of capitalism. It's not, you can't write a bill for it and take it to Sacramento and pass it, this year. But you can think about that in other ways. So for instance, one of the things that really appeals to me about widespread use of renewable energy is that it'll pour a lot less carbon into the atmosphere, which is a good thing because that might keep the planet from self-destructing. Another thing that's good about it is it should begin to at least somewhat reorient the power, the who has power in our world. As long as you depend on resources that are only available in a few places, the people who happen to control those few places are going to end up with way outsized power. So, the king of Saudi Arabia or the Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons who used their winnings to degrade and deform our democracy, or most painfully this year, Vladimir Putin. In a world that ran on sun and wind, Vladimir Putin would have nothing. Russia would actually have to develop something, other to do than just be a gas station for the rest of the world. So that strikes me as the most practical thing we could do in the next few years to change who has power in our society, and with it raise serious questions for how capitalism works in our world, because clearly at the moment it's not working great. The most important election of my lifetime was the one that Ronald Reagan won. And he won it arguing that markets solved most problems, that government was a problem, not a solution. Well, if markets solved all problems, the Arctic wouldn't be mostly melted at this point, So we better figure out how to change those power balances.
I mentioned the Conference of the Parties a little while ago, and you may be familiar with Al Gore's Climate Reality project, where they they had a 24-hour telethon and just tried to get people to know this event is coming and you can learn about what's the newest, either disaster or reasons for you to get interested or excited about this. Um, do we need something like that rather than being just focused on internationally? Do we need something like that domestically where we could get folks from different states, elected officials, to say, we're going to send our delegates to the US climate conference. We're going to have all of our representatives from organizations check in. I don't mean that everyone has to get on a plane. I'm not all about that, but we need a way to make sure that we're having a very active discussion here that doesn't get clouded by the fact that once it's international, it loses some teeth as far as who has to participate in the United States.
Well, that might be a good idea. Um, I always think that um, and this may just be me, but I always think that discussions of that kind work better when they're in the middle of campaigns, where you're actually all fighting for something, whatever it is, divestment, something like that. Because then the discussion gets a little more focused. Um, my experience, having been at many of these COPs, for instance, is they're often not very focused. Uh, uh, in fact, truthfully, I think that probably that whole international treaty negotiation system reached its high point in Paris in 2015, and that it will never reach that point again, or at least for the foreseeable future. And truthfully, at the moment, kind of falling apart. Um, the fact that the next COP is in Abu Dhabi and the chairman of it is also the head of the Abu Dhabi oil company is a kind of reminder of how neutered in many ways this system's become.
So building new volunteer numbers takes work, and there's always a risk of attrition through burnout or maybe volunteers feeling underutilized. I don't have to tell you that, but maybe some of our volunteers might be new to this space or haven't really experienced that side of things. Do you have any thoughts on how we build the movement and strengthen it with limited resources and staffing?
Well, look, the Sierra Club was the past master at this, because if John Muir figured out early on that building strong bonds between people who are involved in this work was key, and one of the ways to do it was to go hiking. My father was a member. He lived in California in the 50s, and he was a member of the Sierra Club when it was mostly a hiking club. But the fact that he had 100 friends who were diehards for getting off to Yosemite on the weekends meant that when David Brower transformed it into a truly fighting movement in the 60s, he was there to help, and many, many thousands of others. So, building those kind of, the work itself is not always spiritually rewarding enough to keep us there. We've got to have some other connections that allow us to keep doing. So, like I said, music or art, or the outdoors, or often great organizing comes out of faith and religious connections, or on and on and on.
So I hope I can say that we're past the growth of climate denialism and that it's shrinking fast, due in no small part to the tireless efforts of you and the folks present at this meeting. But what's the next challenge on how the climate movement must affect faster change and transformation?
Well, the fight now is, there is plenty of climate denialism still out there because there's a increasingly strong nihilistic spirit in our political life that anybody who's spent any time on Twitter knows about. I don't know how to defeat that just complete, outright nihilism. Um, um, I think the bigger problem at the moment is a kind of uh, what Alex Steffen has called predatory delay, a kind of denialism by delay, the kind of greenwashing. the chevrons of the world pretending that they're doing something when they're not to help, and on and on and on. And that saps the strength of movements. So, and that's hard. You have to spend a lot of time, um, establishing uh, uh, the truth over and over and over again, which is tiring work. The good news is that one of the things that now is very much on our side, and that wasn't even 5 or 10 years ago, is the sheer fact that renewable energy has become the cheapest way to. I mean, we live on a planet where the cheapest way to generate power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. Uh, that's that's a wild card that didn't exist a few years ago, and it's probably the most important wild card we have if we're going to make really big change in the time that we have. And now in this country, we have a pot of money, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, that could help cement that in. Um, I mean, it's not by any means perfect legislation. Varshini Prakash and the rest of the Sunrise Movement started the Green New Deal by asking for $30 billion, which would have been about, or $30 trillion, which would have been about right. By the time that works its way through Congress and through Joe Manchin and whatever else, it's $389 billion, which is a lot less, but it's still the first serious effort like this we've had. And so one of our jobs now is to make good on that, and in the process, really transform how people think about things. And the good news is not just that this stuff is cheap, but that the technology that we need is terrific. The estimate is there's about a billion machines in American households that need replacing, between furnaces and stoves and vehicles and so on and so forth. And happily, the stuff that we need to replace them with is better than the stuff that we have now. Uh, if you have to have a car, an EV is better than any other car you've ever had. And happily, an e-bike makes biking possible for way more people than it used to be. A heat pump is a better heating and cooling alternative than what you've got now. Cheaper, quieter, more effective. So on. To me, though it's not the most important, the most clearest example may be the induction cooktop for your kitchen. Um, we now have really good data demonstrating that something like 600,000 cases of childhood asthma in this country come from growing up in a house with a gas stove, which, if you think about it, makes sense. You've essentially got a campfire in your kitchen. It shouldn't be a big surprise that it's producing particulates that end up in people's lungs. Um, um, Confronted with that piece of data, the fossil fuel industry threw a conniption. The Times reported that they were spending tens of millions of dollars hiring influencers and actors to pretend that you have to have a blue flame in your home to, cook your dinner. They rallied their, troops of politicians. Matt Gaetz declared that he would surrender his gas stove when it was pried from his cold, dead fingers, which is A, an odd image for a heating device, and B, it's also hard to imagine Matt Gaetz doing a lot of cooking, to tell you the truth. But at any rate, they're a reminder that, that these are places where we can make quick change. You can buy an induction cooktop for $60 on Amazon. I used one for years until we finally installed an induction cooktop. It works better than the thing you have now. It's really good. And why wouldn't you do it? So I think that if we figure out, but it's going to take some organizing to make this stuff happen, because you don't normally think about it. You normally only think about your furnace when it breaks, and then the only thing you think about is how quickly can I get it replaced. We have to quickly build the kind of organizing infrastructure, and groups like We Rewiring America are really starting to do this, that help community by community, organize the kind of drives we need to get this stuff installed. And uh, that's a different organizing challenge and an exciting one.
So I'm going to raise this because you are working with Third Act now. In a lot of the reading that I've done over the years about the climate movement, the subject of we need to do this like we did in World War II always comes up. We need to mobilize. and it reminds me that the generation that lived through World War II or that remembers the stories from their parents of World War II still have that ability to share with us the concept of rationing, the concept of, well, we didn't have new cars for 10 years. Everybody made do with what they had. Another thing I read in a book was describing how it's not our role to change the course of action in the future. It's going to change. It may be our role to make sure that it happens soon enough. Because if we don't act soon enough, that's where we hit those tipping points. Do you have any thoughts on that World War II kind of paradigm, and also, the race, and how do we communicate to folks that this is not just about will we do it, but how quickly we need to do it?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, that point is the unarguable bottom line here. This is a timed test. We're not used to timed tests. Most of our political things we fight about forever and forever. We make a little bit of incremental progress and come back a few years later, try to make a little more. That's sort of how human systems work. Compromise is the problem here is that our adversary is, in the end, physics. And physics is immature, not interested in compromise, not good at listening, doesn't meet you halfway. It just does what it's going to do. And it's set the limits, and it's our job to meet them. And that means we have to move much faster than is comfortable, which makes the World War II analogy so important, because that was the last time that we really faced an existential threat in our world, I think. When we had to figure out how to defeat fascism uh, at a moment when it looked like fascism was going to win. Um, and uh, and I'll just say first, well, the first thing is, yes, we do actually have members at Third Act who were in the military in World War II, and it's quite amazing to talk to them. They're very old now. There's not many of them left, but I'm very glad that they're there because they're very clear about what they were fighting for and why. Second thing is that, this was another case when we had to move with dispatch, and we did. The great lessons for me around World War II, they have something to do with, the recycling and rationing and things. Those things are important. And if you go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which I recommend doing if you're in New Orleans, you get a sense of sort of what life on the home front was like. But the most important thing that we did was figure out how to gear up an economy to change and produce things very, very, very rapidly. Within a year, we converted most of the industrial plant of the country to producing the material we needed to defeat fascism. We vast factories able to churn out a B-1 bomber every hour. Compared to that, building wind turbines or solar panels is a breeze. These things are not as complex as that. But we're out of practice doing it, and we're out of practice in the kind of social solidarity that it requires to move in that direction. I wrote a long piece for the New Republic 4 or 5 years ago, just talking in great detail about that World War II experience and what it taught us. And I do think that it's worth understanding the climate fight as a kind of war. A war we're losing because the other side, physics, is now taking big swaths of territory and rendering them, beyond our ability to control, and so on and so forth. We're getting a little bit of sort of deja vu watching events in the Ukraine. The first land war in Europe in a very, very long time. Um, and it's been very heartening to see that one of the reactions has been to understand that we need to change in somewhat the same ways. The EU has dramatically picked up the pace at which it's converting to renewable energy. One of the first big campaigns we ran at Third Act was what we called Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom. And within 90 days, we managed to get the Biden administration to put $250 million in the Defense Production Act to produce heat pumps to get them, to places where they were needed, so that Putin couldn't, hold Europe hostage against the winter. So there are hopeful things, but of course, what the other forces in our society did, the oil companies, was do everything they could to try and take advantage of that situation and make huge profits, off Putin, who they'd spent decades funding and helping in lots of ways. They were, in this case, war profiteers, and of the most disgusting kind. So there's lots of good lessons from the past. I will just say that the reason I admire President Biden, and admire him more than I thought I would, I'm a good Vermonter, so I'm a Bernie guy. Um, the reason I admire him is because it feels to me like he is trying to bring back not the Obama or the Clinton era, but the LBJ era. The idea that America is a group project and we work together to make big, powerful change from the center. That's an idea that we abandoned with, the election of Ronald Reagan, and to see it coming back is potentially powerful and important.
Okay, question from our Q&A box, which, guys, if you want to ask a question, please send them out. Are you aware of programs to utilize behavioral science to engage citizens and to affect behavioral change that serves environmental goals? For example, changing energy use behavior.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the things I know about sort of fall, under, I mean, the sort of behavioral science slash advertising campaigns of that kind. I mean, it's advertisers who are good at behavioral science in an applied sense in our world, right? And so people like David Fenton, whose new book, whose title I'm forgetting, but who's been doing PR on around this stuff for a long time and running interesting campaigns, has written a lot about this. And again, I think it's easiest when it's in the context of some fight that you're having. Otherwise, it gets very difficult to get people to focus on it. But if you can do it in the context of some place where you're really in the middle of an ongoing battle about something, then I think that education sinks in more easily.
What you just said there reminded me of I think it's on Facebook or Twitter, one of these social media. Someone took the persona of God and had some fun with that for a few years. So maybe we need the persona of the planet on social media to really try to drive home these ideas and make people think, well, yeah, of course, that's what the planet would say about what we're doing here. Maybe we need to look at it from that perspective. Another question: does spirituality have a role to play in the fights for movement building?
Boy, I think so. One of the first groups that we set up when we started Third Act was Third Act Faith, which is lots and lots of retired rabbis and pastors and so on and so forth. And they've been one of the most important and active groups that we've got going. I've long thought that it's never been the absolute focus of my work, but I've helped for 30 years to try and build a religious environmental movement. And I'm very glad to see that one now firmly exists, between interfaith power and light and green faith and things. And it's had some huge and important victories. The most important was the decision of Pope Francis to write his encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si, which for my money is probably the most interesting and thoroughgoing critique we've had so far this millennia. A truly important and powerful document that has reoriented slowly what's probably the largest organization on planet Earth, the Roman Catholic Church, in the right direction. It's a big institution that moves with somewhat ponderously, but once it gets moving in one direction, it tends to continue moving in that direction. So I think we're going to see real results from that in the years to come, and more from every faith direction, I hope, because I think that this is an important part, as I said earlier, of appealing to whichever side of the human brain it is that wants something more than a new raft of statistics.
Bill, we're getting close to the end of the hour. Any other thoughts that you kind of came into this wanting to share with us? We really appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Well,
I know you're at retirement age, and I really appreciate the fact that you can take a Saturday in the middle of the day and work with us. It's fantastic.
Well, look, for me, it's just a great opportunity to get to say thanks to everybody at the club. Sierra Club is the most important environmental organization in the world. In many ways, it was set the template for what an NGO is in this world, because there weren't comparable organizations when the club began. And I'm very proud to be a life member and to have gotten the Muir Award at one point or another, and very proud to have known David Brower and liked him, spent time with him in Yosemite and places, and to have known Mike Brune, and now to know Ben Jealous, and just the incredible group of leaders, top to bottom. And the way that the Sierra Club's figured out how to organize itself so that there can be a national and a local presence is something that all of us learn from all the time. I'll look forward to being in California later this year to do some. People are having me out to do some of this campaigning around defeating this referendum on the setbacks and things, and to work for that divestment stuff, and just to do all the kind of day in, day out work that it takes to give us a fighting chance. I do think that the key thing is, while we do all that day in, day out work, to once in a while come together across the movement for particular actions. And so I will look forward to seeing pictures from everywhere in California on March 21st. Get out in front of those banks or inside. I'm going to be in DC that day, and Third Act is taking the lead in DC, and we're going to blockade those banks. We've got 50 rocking chairs lined up, and they're going to be, that's what's going to be blocking the front doors of all those banks. Figure out some clever and powerful things to do in California. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. This is the capital in capitalism that we're talking about. But if we can cause them a little bit of pain that day, it will go a long way. And it's just a good reminder of how once in a while we've got to come together as movements just to demonstrate how big we are. So many thanks to everybody for enormously good work. And on we go.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bill.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Hyan, thank you. Take care.
Thank you. All right, Karl. Thank you so much. That was awesome. So now we're going to take a break.